Yeah, I'm in the mood to make another one, so we'll go ahead and do a double feature at this point. This won't really be a video as much as it will just be a conversation. And really, I want this to be, I guess, maybe a little insightful, a little inspirational, more of a nudge to help get, I guess, a little more activity out there, to give people the idea that they can do something. I just want to go over my PvE module, the one that I prepared in the weeks before Vegas and took there to actually play in person and just have a good time. With that being said, that wouldn't have been possible if it weren't for my local play group. Thank you, Chase, Shelby, Aaron, Greg. Thank you for showing up and putting in the time the week before Vegas to help me get a few playtest rounds in, balance some things out, see some problem areas, make some changes, put your feedback and advice in, round those things out. Thank you. You know, like we said, from every 5 minutes, community. That's everything, and that's what this is all about. So this is more of a conversation. It's a me to you kind of thing. We're sitting in a room, having a sip, and just talking about why do what we do. And so PvE to me, as I've said in the past, is really just ingrained in a part of my history. Not to get to the more sentimental side, some things don't last forever, and sometimes all you ever have left are memories. And to me, PvE has that attachment. It's just a part of my life. It was a moment in history, a moment in time. And back with the WoW TCG, we, like I said, me after school, play those decks for fun. Beat them sometimes, not others. That was the whole point. And everyone I talk to today still, like I said, I've played games with at some point in time. TCGs have networked me to see people. And when you play a game with someone, you really start to see who and what they are. We all react differently, right? I'm not perfect. No one's perfect. But you get to see who and what we are. And yeah, PvE to me matters. So when it came to Flesh and Blood, trying to talk my friends into it, getting in early 2020, I always kind of brought up the idea of what if PvE became a thing? I mean, it's an RPG style kind of game. Like, you have heroes, you choose an avatar, you have the equipment. It's plausible, right? A lot of my friends are like, you know what? If PvE becomes a thing, then yeah, sure, I'll try it. I'll give it a go. Okay, deal. And from there, it was more of like a what if, and obviously we got a little bit of confirmation. Might be coming sooner rather than later. Might not be. Don't want to set myself up for hopes, disappointment, things like that. It'll have its place in time. But to me, I wanted to get something fun for my local play group, something fun for my friends to get them engaged and involved with the idea, understanding how it could play out, and draw engagement on that front. It was more of a personal thing. With the PvE club, it's become more of a thing to provide to other people too. I'm not saying what I've put together is perfect by any means. It's just a thing. It's something I wanted to test, try out, and pass out. Let people try, do their compositions of teams, characters, heroes, strategies. Put forth the effort, see what happens. Get the feedback, the information on it. This conversation is about how I went about the first cornerstone to lock in what the strategy was going to be, what the boss was going to be like. Do I even follow the Flesh and Blood model? Do I use equipment? Because back in the original video I did way back in January with Louis, what I proposed, it's not even right here, what I proposed had equipment, but it was a dragon. It doesn't wear socks and shit and pants and gloves and spicy goggles and whatnot. It's just wings, claws, feet, maybe a couple scales. How do those interact in the fight? And so part of PvE to me is that immersive side of it. So first and foremost, if you want to start off with something, to me, the ground roots of that was, the lore book or the articles on the website. Learn more about the zones, the territories, like what do they stand for? What's the purpose? What exists there? What's the feeling? What's the atmosphere? And so went to the beach for a trip this past summer, read a lot of articles and chapters, bits of the lore book, and just had to find a place to start. And so to me, the safest place to go without encroaching, on LSS's design, to me was the Savage Lands. And so right out of the gates, I wanted to do something based on that area or territory that's full of the unknown, because it's so dangerous and so treacherous. We don't know much about it yet. So that was my first choice, is like, what makes sense for me in this position right now? Secondly, from playing those, the first thing I thought about was, well, each deck had its own design or strategy. And even then, looking at those designs or strategies, they were translated from an already designed, laid out fight in a video game that was just simply translated to a tabletop TCG version. So we didn't have anything to go off of except for just experience or history. And so first and foremost, if you're talking about my fascination with Flesh and Blood, or with any game in that matter, I'm a huge advocate for pet classes. Hell, my Necromancer in D&D just hit level 5, and I can bring anything back to life, and I just have a lot of fun ruining the day for everyone else. But looking at Flesh and Blood, the lore book in the original list of classes, seeing Necromancer right there out of the gate, the first thing I thought of was like, oh, well, allies or something of the like will come to the game eventually, right? Like, you can't have a Necromancer if he's not bringing something back from the dead. I mean, there was always the possibility that could have been something like an action or an attack action that becomes like the animation itself, kind of like when you look at like brute cards being like beasts attacking on behalf of Leviathan and whatnot. But either way, it's a ramble and a rant. That's one. What I was looking for was, I guess, referring back to like the WoW TCG time. Yeah, you can have a boss encounter, but sometimes having ads or things to manipulate the fight or swarm the fight added an extra variable to it. So you can have PvE content that is simply a boss that you have a challenging interaction with, or you can have a boss who leads a horde of beasts. And I was like, yeah, that's where we're going to go eventually. And that initial leap into that field really came from the idea that Flesh and Blood had already kind of shaped out and fleshed out what the rules would be around allies, thanks to Monarch, seeing Ursa and Blasphemophet. And so one of the first inspirations I got towards this was the idea of how players have to handle the presence of allies on the field. If you didn't know, I'm a huge fan of Coax Commotion, like a lot of people. Seeing the market update the way it did recently, maybe a good investment. I guess we'll see in the long run. Maybe it's a reprint. Hopefully it's a reprint. PvE, it's going to happen, right? Coax was a great card in the sense of it requires it to hit. Not hit a hero, hit. And as it sits right now, you can't use defense to block for allies when they're attacked. They're attacked, and they take that damage. So the reality was, I can create a PvE module, potentially have it a little more challenging. You can have cards like Promise of Plenty, cards like Coax of Commotion, that can target allies to clean up the field, but then provide group benefits along the way. It's about how you strategize and how you approach and how you handle this and when you set up and when you don't. Gregarian Tome, I don't know, we've seen some of that, and it feels more like a trap than not. It really depends on who sees it first, when you see it, how you see it. Do you burn them early? Do you hold them to save them late? It's still questionable. But the moral of the story came down to, I chose, where do I want this encounter to be? Secondly, I chose, what do I want the encounter to really encompass as a general strategy? And it was more of an ad fight, having creatures or beasts swarming the opponents. It's an idea of being outnumbered and pressured in that sense. So then it came down to, okay, so first and foremost, what's our villain? And I say the term villain because early on, looking at giving classes, I guess, purpose and weights within the realm of an encounter, one of the first things you come across with Wizard, for example, it says deal X damage to target hero. And you're like, okay, well, would heroes be really fighting other heroes? And it didn't feel right. And so I think the term villain, at least for me, and I took a lot of liberties making keywords and things like that. It wasn't meant to encroach or overstep bounds, but I think it's almost necessary to make a self-contained deck or event like this function as part of the balancing. The one rule I made for myself was not creating new card types. I wanted LSS to kind of set the standard for that. And like landmarks, for example, things like that slowly became integrated into this module because they existed, and I wanted to see how they could actually change the gameplay as a whole. So, looking at the matriarch being labeled as a villain, one of the first rules I kind of made is the villain can be targeted like a hero would, but they're not affected like a hero would be. So, for example, if a card like a wizard says deal X damage to target hero, you can target a villain with that effect to deal damage to them. However, Coax a Commotion, each hero gets X, Y, Z. You don't get the benefit of being a hero, and that was more of like a balancing thing. And terminologies in games change over time. I'm not saying anything's wrong with the way it is. I just couldn't see a world where there wasn't a rule in place to kind of differentiate between those two types of cards. But this is the matriarch. This is her in all her glory. Before I went to Road to Nationals in West Virginia, I kind of talked about the enrage mechanic, and it was more of like a balancing tool because 1v4, if cards only have X amount of block value, you only defend so much, allowing the 4 players to kind of put enough pressure on you eventually over time to dwindle you down. So this enables the matriarch to do one of two things, either have cards to defend with, or to have enough cards to do a heavy aggressive pressuring turn to the enemies to kind of pivot that back on them to force them to react accordingly. From the first iteration, I thought this was a great idea, but it didn't actually enable choice or agency for the players. And so I think I was driving home from work later one night, and just like a conversation like this, talking to myself, kind of just bouncing ideas, and probably the silliest moment of my life and a realization, looking back at the WoW TCG, and I was like, man, taunts, tanking. I'd done that video on Guardians way back, and I was like, Guardian to me feels like the tank, but there's no taunts mechanic or things like that, and it dawned on me, why couldn't that come from the encounter itself? I'd already said before and previously that maybe you create a mechanic or a card style that's big and imposing, and then the Guardian, using its class design or cards available within its pool, within its class, can use that defensively to kind of keep pushing the fight and actually protecting their team, therefore playing the tank role. Now, I think this was probably the better way to go. Like I said, it's not perfect. We're still testing things out. But threats. The idea is that when you attack the boss, yeah, you give them card advantage, but you get a threat token. It's an aura, really. So you're just pissing the boss off. You slap it in the face. You're like, no. And then you get that threat token. What do you do with that threat token? Let me show you. By the way, like I said, caveman computer stuff. I bought this little program because this was simpler for me to learn than Figma, because time and stuff. There we go. You can change the colors and stuff. It's so neat. Threat. Originally, the first iteration of threats was really redirecting any kind of attack to a hero, but I guess in the sense of flavor, theme, it didn't make sense to be attacking the boss and then being able to control where the allies go. Yes, allies. There's a bunch of different those. I'll show you those. So I think once we were in Vegas in the middle of that game, we actually got into a discussion about, well, does that seem flavorful? Does that seem fair? And I think we all came to agreement it makes more sense for the threat tokens to come from attack action cards or weapons, controlled by the boss, because, you're doing your thing to them, and you're kind of drawing their attention away. So this goes back to the whole player agency, having control over what's happening in the fights. So here's your options. So even when I built my first Guardian deck to kind of play the tank role for this, the first thing I thought about was like, well, I need more like go again actions or things like that, or go again attack actions, because I wanted Bravo to have the opportunity to kind of hit the boss, break the action chain, hit the boss again, combat chain breaks again, hit it one more time, call it a day. Whether you're tickling it for 1 damage, whatever else, attacking it, yeah, it's drawing a card at the beginning of the game. You give it 3 cards, but at the same time, you generate 3 threat. You're generating it early. You can hold on to it, put it in your pocket, save it for a rainy day when he goes after the wizard, starts beating the skull in with a swift stomping. The relativity is you choose how you want to play, and the threat tokens give the players options later on when they feel more pressured into a corner, in a sense. The second part you've already seen. We haven't changed anything there. Simply once per turn action, 3 resources, create a beast ally token. If you don't control a beast ally token or an ally in play, go again. This goes back to that ideology I had the first time, that looking at the history of Flesh and Blood heroes, a lot of them are just enablers for a strategy. Especially the Welcome Wraith heroes. It's like I want to hit hard with Bravo, so when the time is right and I have the right resources, the right sitting, give it dominate. Combo, for ninja, I have the combo set the way I need it to be. I'm gonna use the hero's ability to get the last piece that I need and enable the full effectiveness of the deck. And so I just wanted it to be simple. It's a go wide strategy. So let's create a board presence, and then cards in the deck will be designed around the idea that if you have an ally in play, you might get a bonus effect, or things can't happen unless an ally is in play, or cards can't be played unless an ally is in play. Or maybe having an ally in play restricts things from being played. That's a balance too. This last half was all post-calling play. The first raid deck I've ever played was the Onyxia Lair raid deck, and of course, if you've played the video game, it's a 3-stage fight. I didn't really want to copy that to a T. I didn't want to believe in stages or things like that. However, with the system and engine of Flesh and Blood, it felt like it was very easy for the boss to get kind of backed into a corner. And once you got below that 30 to 20 health life range, it was just nearly impossible to come back, because 9 times out of 10, you've played a handful of turns and the opponent's decks have been thinned out. And if they were playing smart and wise and stacking their deck, they're getting bigger turns coming back. And so when they're set up for a really big strategy, but you yourself are not there, it seemed more punishing than not. Some turns were coming 12, 17 damage. Yeah, I'm drawing 1 card from Enrage, but that's still only blocking for 3, 4, maybe 5. Yeah, I just died. And kudos to the Vegas team. You guys did a fantastic job at the calling. You guys played it well. You were very open-minded to the idea that I had no idea what I was doing. We were testing this, playing it out, and we got improvements from it because of your feedback. And shout out to you. Thank you for that. So at that point, started designing the idea of, so if the matriarch falls below a certain health total, then maybe it draws 2 cards from Enrage. Or if it falls below an additional health total, it gets maybe 3 cards from Enrage. It's more of a balancing tool as well, because I've never wanted to see a PvE encounter where you walk into it the first time, you're like, oh, I've played games before. I know how this works. I'm going to do this to succeed. I don't like the idea of a challenge like this, an event or an experience, being a one and done kind of feel. Because if you beat it the first time, I guess you can enjoy the moment, but what was the end game? What was the purpose? And so having these obstacles is more like a plan, do, review kind of moment. It's like, okay, so we need to get the boss as close to 50 as possible, set ourselves up, and then start going to town. At that point, we have 2 or 3 turns, maybe probably 2 at this point, to kind of get the boss over that last 50 damage between 4 players. Can we do it? And as another balancing tool as well, worry about the matriarch being overwhelming with an additional 3 cards per player attack. Generating more threat tokens later on seemed to be a viable improvement as well. There's another card that'll help that make more sense. But this being an ally deck, let's kind of break into that too. So with this, RNG can sometimes be a bad thing. It can feel punishing, but at the same time, I think RNG can also be exciting. I know, like when you're playing a combo deck and it bursts and it goes off and you chain it out, you're like, it worked. That was exciting, because you're just holding on to the edge of your seat, seeing if it'll actually happen. When it comes to RNG, like in a PvE module, what I was looking at was, it's not all the same kind of beast, right? Like, it would be kind of boring if you just summons allies the whole time. You just get these 2/2 vanilla, just attacks goes again. I wanted to have a little more fun with that. Like I said, I took a little bit of liberties with the keywords. I kind of made a few things up as I went. And one of the first things I wanted to do was make a keyword that enabled the allies to kind of do what they want to do. And that kind of plays into something else we'll cover here in just a moment. The idea was that the allies don't have a bias or a brain of their own, in a sense. Whoever's player playing the matriarch is the one kind of governing the encounter and the fight. However, a minion is just a minion, unless you control it. That's a thing. We'll get to that in a moment. But the aimless mechanic is meant to be more of like attack a player at random. So here you have a 4-player game, well, 5-player with an actual player boss, and you just roll a 4-sided die, and your ally will attack player 1, 2, 3, or 4. And so based on how many allies you have on the board, that could be devastating if you could target wherever you want it to be every single time, or you can just leave it up to chance. It's RNG. And a lot of these beasts attack for 1, 2, or 4 damage, so they're not very imposing, but with other cards in the game and within the module itself, it can put a lot of pressure at certain times based on how the game unfolds. So the Savage Beast is your vanilla, very basic 2 attack, 2 health minion ally. The more basic one, I tried to color code these two because when you're playing on the table, you're just seeing handwritten proxy cards. The colors helped identify, low threat, medium threat, high threat. Here's one of the actual designed allies that you get randomly as a chance. I believe in the 30-card ally deck, there are 6 of these. Originally, there were more, but the problem was, I've argued from day one, sorry, this mustache is killing me today. The hairs keep going up my nose. I apologize. One of the first things I came across with Loyal Beasts with the intercept mechanic, I had more of these because I wanted them to kind of be consistently there to kind of force players to have to react to things and think about how they want to attack each turn. However, it took away from that player agency argument. Every time we did this, and we flipped allies from the deck, because I think I had 14 originally, almost every other turn one of these was hitting the board, and I could almost see on my players' faces, like, more things we have to kind of fight through in order to get to what we want to attack. And so to me, that felt punishing. It took away from the player's experience to kind of make a choice. You want the RNG of something like this to pop up to maybe interrupt a plan, but not be a static thing to have to kind of mow through consistently. And then the last ally type I had was the Infected Beast. Reading the lore book, especially one of the little paragraphs they had talking about like the flora, the toxins and things like that, the mushrooms, just the different things around in the environment. It's how it was like a very unsafe place. Looking at the beasts themselves living in this place, like, could they not, be infected by their surroundings or evolve to handle or host their surroundings? And so I wanted to have a more aggressive type of ally that kind of had a downside to it. So first off, it comes in with 4 attack. Only 1 health, so you can Kodachi it all day long if you feel like it, unless other things prevent you from dealing that much damage. And then from there, players have to choose. Okay, well, I can't afford to have -1 intellect. I'm the tank. I have to block as much damage for you guys, so one of you needs to kind of handle this problem. And you don't have to, There's no obligation to attack this, but the consequence of that could be more damage on the following turn if you don't handle the threats. And so this is more of that agency again, assessing the problem. How do you want to engage it? How does your team want to handle it? Is it a current issue? Or do you want to kind of just go crazy on the boss itself and try to push and plow through the 50 to 15 health range? What's your strategy? What's your approach? That was one of the key takeaways from that. When it comes to the equipment, for a while I was wondering, do I even want equipment in this? Like, it is a Beast of the Savage Lands, and I think I had to kind of get in the back of my mind that equipment doesn't always mean, like in reference to the dragon, that is, equipment doesn't always mean gear or accessories. Sometimes it can just be a part of what it is and is more an enhanced version. However, what we're looking at here actually is a thing with the matriarch. Think about a story or immersion to PvE. Obviously, it's not my world. I don't want to, take liberties with that. But what if there were other gems of amazing legendary power scattered all across Wraith, and one of them was just lost in a world long ago, and a beast comes across it, and it kind of merges symbiotically and fuses with the matriarch, and gives the matriarch powers, maybe influence or things like that, to control the aimless allies and guide the tide of battle. When it came to this piece of gear, the idea of this one specifically was to give the actual encounter some depth or presence or true choice of gameplay. So, for example, you saw the matriarch has 120 health. You could just run 4 melee heroes, get like a dash, guardian, Warrior. What else could you possibly want? You could do two warriors. You could do a Bolton and a Dorinthia. Why not? Have fun. You want to be aggressive? You want to go sword and board and just go to town on it? Try to push through 120 damage. You might be able to. However, what if you want to use arcane heroes? What if you want to use Kano? What if you want to use Viserai, Briar? Is there a benefit to having the arcane? To me, yeah, there are. And there's actually more than just one benefit in this original design. Looking at this helm, first and foremost, allies you control lose aimless. As long as you control the power of the matriarch, which I think in the original design, I actually had the art here. It's a little thing right there in the head. The idea was that this little gremlin-infected 10-story tall beast had influence over the horde. And as long as the power of the matriarch was intact, then they could simply do whatever they want. Built in other mechanics here as well. I wanted to give early threat of card advantage if necessary, if RNG fell in place. Like I said, RNG, Flesh and Blood is such a fun, when balanced game. RNG, like in the brute style, can be rewarding or punishing. In this sense, I just wanted to have that potential to be punishing, or just we dodged a bullet. More to kind of give the matriarch more of a threatening presence if things just end up going the wrong way. If there was ever a mode of Flesh and Blood to ever have the RNG to be a consequence, I think this would be it. Because in PvE, I don't like using the word casual as much, but it's a low stakes environment. And because of that, I think you're able to just appreciate the experience and not feel like you've lost out on something, and you can grow from that as well. So the idea is that here, it's a potential up gain for the boss, and then potentially no downside otherwise. And then Arcane Affinity, like I said, because keywords are just fun to make up. Arcane Affinity was the idea of the helm itself being magical in a sense, and having the possibility of absorbing arcane damage, and that was the key to destroying it. So originally this number was at 20, because I'm like, well, if you want to have a couple good turns, like the way the boss encounter starts is it always starts with the matriarch first, or the raid boss of PvE going first, still maintaining the same rules of end of the first turn, everyone draws back up. So the matriarch has an opportunity to kind of build a board presence and then kind of do its thing. You can choose to block or take damage accordingly, and then from there kind of play out your first cycle of turns and then come back to the boss. I was trying to think realistically with an opening hand to a secondary hand, like say you had a wizard acting on the boss's turn versus their turn. How much instant damage could you potentially pump out on a good opening hand versus an average opening hand versus a bad opening hand? And so I started with 20 health on the helm to begin with. Then I slowly kind of evolved to realize, like, well, what if they're running a Viserai and a Kano? Or what if they just wanted to go Viserai, Kano, Briar, and then like a Dorinthia for ad control, and they just kind of burst this down. Ads go aimless. They're easy to kind of control and destroy and prevent damage for because they're not honing in on one target and kind of playing the game of bias. What's your strategy? And I was like, well, because they have the potential as more heroes come out, more arcane damage could become more prevalent or easier to accomplish. Maybe we want to kind of up that baseline to maybe 40 to kind of make a choice of, do I want more physical damage or more arcane damage? What's my strategy for handling this fight? And maybe even then doubling it might have been too much. Maybe 30 is the better balance. And so hopefully if we can get some playtesting in, we'll figure that out in time. Another issue we had was a lot of wizard effects, for example, required damage to be dealt in order for other things to happen. I think the original implementation of this piece of gear actually prevented the damage. However, I just wanted to redirect, that way it wouldn't shut a wizard down completely. That's more of like a little like mini personal oversight thing with like having no experience with this, but we figured it out. And I kept going with the equipment. It's kept having a lot more fun with it. The blood-caked extremity, which are the leg pieces. One fear I have for the boss, you shouldn't feel bad for the boss, but I kind of do as the creator of this one, is that on-hit effects can really matter. And, this whole thing was designed before Oldhim was even known to the public. I actually had to reduce the cost of a lot of the cards with the potential case of having an Oldhim and Alexi both being based on ice, just completely shutting down this entire encounter. Even with the enrage mechanics drawing more cards, the fear of upping the cost of cards to require you to pitch 2-3 cards to kind of get a board presence started, plus a potential extra additional cost to use each once per turn action off of the allies to attack and generating more frostbites off of that. had to find some kind of balance to kind of keep it threatening, but still having the options to play classes that can control that form of outcome from the game. But this original design here was more towards things like Azalea, with the on-hit effects of Remorseless or things like that, or maybe even like a Spinal Crush, for example, losing Go again for the entire next turn. Oh, I'm going to attack with this one attack action and ignore my allies because I can't do anything else anyway. Your turn. The goal wasn't to kind of keep the boss neutered at all times. It's more of a time and place thing. So with the ebb and flow of gameplay, the boss has a big turn, summons 4, 5, 6 allies, pumps them, attacks them, puts a lot of pressure on the enemies. Whether you have aimless, active, or inactive, choose your targets, or not choose your targets, have random targets. Goes back to the player's turns. They kind of clean up the field to kind of crowd control. With that, counters go back to the blood-caked extremity to kind of help balance the tide of battle. Because at that point, they're so focused on the allies, you're not gaining card advantage for being attacked yourself unless you have someone intentionally trying to generate the threat tokens. And then from there, you have a defensive possibility to kind of force through or prevent a big force through of an on-hit effect that would kind of shut you down for an entire cycle of turns. However, I still wanted there to be a means of, if the players were smart, magnetic shockwave, things like that, to kind of force this to block if necessary, to kind of break it and burst through. You have that kind of player agency to have a way of breaking this, or with some of the new ice cards, or even like Mangle, for example. I don't know if you can give -1, yeah, scratch the Mangle part. But there's different targets to kind of reduce the quality of the equipment or break them, and so there are elements of control on that sense of the field. The other two pieces of equipment were just more for like flavor and expression, with potential help. Like I said, I mentioned ice being a big concern from the very beginning of seeing Oldhim coming out of the woodworks, and so I wanted to have an option to potentially reduce the cost of cards. Lastly, on this one specifically, back to the whole making up keywords as I go, the Savage Hide. I made a comment way back when to a couple friends, like, if you want to have an encounter in the Savage Lands, shouldn't there be some kind of like home territory advantage? And one of the first thoughts I had was, well, maybe something around the brute theme should have an advantage against these beasts or creatures because they live in the same environment or they've encountered before, and there's tactics and they understand what's going on. And so what I kind of built into this was, if you're playing something like a ninja, sure, potentially Broadside the Beast can just keep taking those Kodachis all day long. It's not an issue, it's not a threat. But you have Smash with Big Tree come through, Big Beast can't handle. And so maybe if it has to be forced at the end of the game when it's trying to pivot back to block with Broadside of the Beast, it has a chance, the opportunity to potentially break this chest equipment. And lastly, trying to follow the tactics of what most equipment does in Flesh and Blood. Grasp of the Queen, the arms themselves, just have the potential option to make one more turn a little more devastating. Nothing too special there. And so lastly, when it comes to basic actions and attack actions and so forth, to kind of wrap this up, it's an ally deck. So what's the most efficient way to make allies? Well, we play, an action. And so originally this was more aggressively costed, like I said before. Ice control was a thing, and this originally cost, I think, 5. So it was 5 resources for 5 beast ally tokens. Go again. Had to kind of bring it down a little bit in case you get to that point where you are having to block to prevent on-hit effects. You can still have a turn, do things. You got all 3 versions of this. Rally the Horde. You got the red version. Obviously, the yellow version makes 4 beasts, and the blue version makes 3 beasts. Simple, straightforward, to the point. Think of it like Read the Runes, but with allies instead. And then lastly, with the regular actions, Home Lair Advantage. This was the card that kind of broke the original playtesting cycle, because if you land 2 or 3 of these, they're just devastating. So you attack me at under 50 health, and I draw a course of 6 additional cards in my turn, but I have enough health to kind of scoot down to maybe 10 health or 12 health and still have a turn coming back. So now I have a potential 10 card hand with you being as aggressive as you were and me just kind of taking the hit. What happens if I have a red pitch of Rally the Horde, 2 Home Lair Advantage in red, 1 in blue, and some other attack action to kind of top it all off at the end? I draw and release some of the infected beasts. They're coming in for 4, 2 of these 3 and 3. This is almost like literally kind of like one round was. So we're looking at 10 damage there, plus another 1 off the blue pitch. So 11 per ally. Per ally. And I just summoned 5 of those if I did get 5 infected beasts. I think it was like, in this version of it, 2 or 3 infected beasts. I think 1 of the loyal beasts, and then 1 of the savage beasts. But either way, the 4 cards themselves were pressuring over 40 plus damage in 1 turn without me even using my attack action cards. And so what I came to realize is we're back to making new keywords again. Just how we have legendary and deck building, what if we have to have something like unique when it comes to board presence? Maybe only 1 copy of this, like the legend rule in Magic. Maybe we only have 1 copy of this aura on the field. Not in the sense of like, oh, it's a legendary, special, one-of-a-kind thing, but strictly in just the sense of balance. I think this is a very crucial kind of card to have because, like I said, a lot of the whole deck was enabling an ally each turn. And so an aura like this helps enable a big pressure turn with your allies, as well as if they clean the whole board up, you can start your next action phase with another beast ally in play without actually having to pitch a card for 3 resources to get 1 off the hero itself. So it's meant to be kind of a pivot setup card as well in case they get a good presence. But yeah, I think going to the unique route for a card like that might be the more responsible thing to do. Lastly, I don't think any kind of PvE encounter is really resembling Flesh and Blood if it doesn't have specializations. And this is not really a specialization in text and form, but I think in flavor and structure it is. And I've talked about a card like this before, back when I did the Guardian video. What if there was a card with some mechanic called Annihilates? And what it does is it targets and splits damage across the entire team, and they have to defend and they have to react together to kind of force and enable that camaraderie of making the good decision of who should take what damage, who should defend with what, who can kind of pivot and get back in the game on their turns. What's the strategy? What's the plan? And that really comes down to the Queen of the Savage Lands. Very aggressively cost 9, goes for 40 damage, blocks for 3. The original iteration of this card cost 9, dealt 60 damage, and did not have the first 2 original clauses guaranteed, and it didn't work out too well. One of the first testing of this card itself, it ended up being more of a finisher, and it wasn't really intended to do so. It was more of a control effect or a board reset. Think of it like a board wipe from any other TCG you've ever played, but more of like a threat board wipe. Reading the card, if an ally has attacked this turn, you may not play Queen of the Savage Lands. That's your restriction. If you've attacked with an ally, you can't play it, because there was a turn where I drew this in, I think, the first or second playtest game, where I already had a board of 7 allies, and so I'm like, attack, 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 hit you all for 60, and they're like, is this even a game? And I was like, you're right. It wasn't meant to happen like that. So we got back to the drawing board, got some balancing out there. Also, when you play Queen of the Savage Lands, destroy all allies you control. Because, like I said, board wipe, reset. Even if you had a big board of allies and you put the pressure on them last turn and they weren't able to kind of swing back and take care of them, this is still going to put them in a bad state, regardless of where you are in the game. I've already told you the Annihilate mechanic. Destroy all equipment that defended Queen of the Savage Lands. That's a reoccurring theme with a lot of the actions in the deck, or attack actions. The key main point of this was to destroy all threat tokens. I said in the very beginning that, back to that agency, do you want your Bravo having some go again actions, being able to hit a couple attacks in, generate a couple extra threat tokens, have them on the side burner just in case things don't go the way you plan them to, or people draw poorly, and you can kind of redirect a couple attacks back to the Guardian, and they can use their defensive reactions to kind of handle things in the moment. This is meant to kind of be like, shh, no. You don't have that kind of agency anymore. We're going to reset the board state, see if you can kind of get back in there, kind of forces the players to have to re-attack the boss, regenerate those threat tokens. By this point, it's probably under 50 health, maybe under 15 health, to kind of get those threat tokens back. It kind of puts you on that edge of your seat kind of moment again, of like, how do I react to this in the moment? And lastly, as a bit of balancing, because it's such a hard pivot of a card, I kind of want the Matriarch to have -1 intellect. That way the Matriarch couldn't go hard and heavy on one turn and then kind of repeat and do the same thing the following turn. Yeah, you get 3 cards, but based on where your opponents are with their life totals, They might have had to block out entirely to make sure they stayed alive, make sure no one actually took enough damage to die. And if that's the case, then they're just drawing up and passing turn. I don't want the boss to be in a position to keep just kind of pounding them down further and further. Maybe it needs to be -2 intellect, kind of get control back of the board states, and then kind of start playing from normal from there. But that's really about all I have to kind of talk about that today. I hope that was enjoyable. I hope you maybe saw about how I'm a little crazy in the moment and thinking about how I want things to blend and feel like an experience. You want it to feel like almost like a big Avengers level threat. You know, you're fighting in the world of Wraith, and this is something that only heroes can engage. And it's supposed to have that kind of weight interaction. It's like if you're playing like a D&D campaign, like you don't want to see your player characters die. There's an attachment to it, even in this world you've made for yourselves. And looking even in the world of Wraith and PvE, I think it kind of holds the same sentiment. And so that camaraderie comes naturally, that you want to work together. And if you have a choice and an option to step up to the plate and take care of your peers, are you not inclined to? Especially if there's a point system or whatever else attached to it. It's not just about winning. It's about winning gracefully, successfully, efficiently. It's how your team works as a whole. So really, that sums up that. That was a bit long, I apologize. But to kind of sum this up and wrap it up, I did want to say I am going to Orlando and kind of trying to do what I did in Vegas. I have a new version of this. It won't be a pretty version, kind of like these horrible text copies that I just showed here on the screen. It'll be my handwritten, proxied, updated version that I like carrying around because it's just really fun. I'm just very old school in that sense. And I want to play it. And the one thing I learned from Vegas, people sometimes go on a trip with a plan, and I totally get that. I was not offended in any way, shape, or form. I was actually very honored how many people stopped by the table to even say, hey, it's cool that this is even a thing. Thank you for being here and doing that. And that made it all worthwhile. Like, well, I'd love to have played more games, sure. But seeing people care about it and having the commentary, stopping by, having a conversation, that made the most of it for me. And so this time around, go into it a little smarter. Going to Orlando, I want to actually host some events. We've talked about the PvE club, and I want to post a channel in there starting today and tomorrow, where I can have time slots between Friday, Saturday, and Sunday this coming weekend when we're all in Orlando for the calling and nationals. And if you want to stop by and play, I'll have time slots kind of put aside. If you want to open a discussion to kind of move a time slot that meets more people's needs or standards based on main events or side events or lunch times or things like that, we can have open discourse on that and plan it out. But I wanted to give people the opportunity to actually be able to engage in this ahead of time in case you wanted to make plans for yourself otherwise. But that's about it. And I thank you for being here for this conversation. I personally enjoyed it, and I can't wait to work on the next module and keep being active on the PvE Discord. And I hope to see you there. I hope you have a good one. I can't wait to see you this coming weekend. Thank you.